Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we take these big, complex research frameworks, the ones that can seem a bit intimidating. And we try to crack them open, really get to the core ideas so you can feel genuinely informed.
Yeah, cut through the jargon.
Exactly. And today, we have a really critical mission. We're doing a deep dive into, well, what you might call the heart of the Sustainable Regionalization Goals, specifically Meta-SRG 2.
Empowered communities and cultural sovereignty.
That's the one. Empowered communities and cultural sovereignty.
And, I'd argue this is maybe the most crucial cluster in the whole framework.
Why is that? More than policy or economics?
Because it focuses squarely on the agents of change, the communities themselves. It's not just about the blueprints, the architecture, which was more Meta-SRG 1.
Right, the policy stuff.
Meta-SRG 2 is really the engine. It's what drives the social and cultural transformation needed for sustainability. Its whole purpose is making sure communities are seen and treated as foundational, as the ones actually doing the sustainable change.
Hey, that's a really important distinction, because often communities are just, well, consulted, maybe, or they're just recipients of some program.
Exactly. And that rarely works long-term. This is different. The sources push for a much deeper role.
So what is that shift? What's the core change here?
It really comes down to legitimacy and resilience. Sustainability efforts, well, they tend to fail if they're just parachuted in from outside, or if they completely ignore the deep cultural history of a place, sometimes ancient history. So Meta-SRG 2 insists that any real transformation has to be rooted in empowered local decision-making. And crucially, in recognizing that there isn't just one way of knowing things. Plural knowledge systems.
Plural knowledge. We'll definitely need to unpack that.
Yeah, it's about making sure sustainability actually makes sense in people's real lived lives. It's about, sovereignty, communities having control over their own future, their own culture.
And I know the theory behind all this, the general world theory, GWT, is pretty central. It views the world differently, doesn't it?
It's key, because GWT sees the world as dynamic, relational, fundamentally plural.
Not just one single reality we all experience the same way.
Right. It rejects that idea that you can have one technical blueprint, one master plan that works for every unique region on Earth. And that inherent plurality, that's precisely why Meta-SRG 2 is so necessary. It provides the framework for dealing with that diversity constructively.
The sources used a really helpful analogy for this, didn't they? About ecosystems.
Yeah, it's a good one. Think about building a resilient ecosystem, like a forest or a wetland. Meta-SRG 1, the policy goal, might be like ensuring you have the structural strength, strong roots, good soil, clear boundaries maybe.
Okay, the basic architecture.
But Meta-SRG 2, that's like recognizing that the real resilience, the ability to bounce back, depends on the diversity and the vitality of everything living in it.
The species, the plants.
The people, their unique cultures, their languages, their ways of doing things, and crucially, the memory held in that system. Like in the soil, in the seeds, in the traditions.
The cultural memory.
That's what allows the ecosystem or the community to actually adapt when things get tough, when shocks happen. Without that vitality, that diversity, you might have a strong structure, sure, but no real capacity to regenerate or adapt. It's just brittle.
That makes so much sense. Structure isn't enough. You need life, diversity, memory.
Yeah.
Okay, so Meta-SRG 2 isn't just one goal, it's a cluster.
That's right. It operationalizes this vision through 5 specific SRGs. We're going to unpack SRG 7, which is about adaptive-regenerative communities.
Okay.
Then SRG 8, focusing on empowered and strong communities, really digging into justice.
Justice, right.
SRG 9 tackles pluralism and narrative resilience, how stories and different viewpoints build strength. SRG 10 gets into that knowledge, diversity, and inclusion piece we mentioned.
The different ways of knowing.
And finally, SRG 11 pulls it all together, looking at eco-cultural vibrancy and well-being, how culture and environment are intertwined.
Got it. 5 interconnected goals. Where should we start? SRG 7.
Let's start right there. SRG 7, Adaptive-Regenerative Communities. This is the blueprint for local adaptation.
Okay, SRG 7, Adaptive-Regenerative Communities. The first thing that jumps out is the language. It asks us to see communities not just as like towns on a map or groups of people.
Right, not just demographics.
But as living, evolving ecosystems.
Yeah.
Or the term they use is biosocial systems. What does that actually mean, calling a community a biosocial system?
It's a fundamental shift in perspective. It means we stop seeing a community as just, say, a collection of consumers or workers, separate from their environment. A biosocial system view recognizes the deep, inseparable connection between the human social fabric, how people organize their culture, their economy, and the specific place they inhabit, the bioregion.
The water, the land, the climate.
The soil, the plants, the animals, everything. It implies these systems need certain capacities. They need adaptive governance, ways to make decisions locally and change course. They need regenerative ecological practices, ways of living that actually heal the environment, not just extract from it. And crucially, they need cultural continuity. They need ways to carry forward their identity and wisdom, specifically in ways that challenge the dominant, often extractive development models.
So the health of the people and the health of the land are like two sides of the same coin. And culture is the operating system that manages that relationship.
That's a great way to put it, the operating system.
So the big question for SRG 7 then becomes, what are the practical frameworks? How do we actually help communities become these adaptive, regenerative, biosocial systems?
Right. How do you build that capacity for regenerative practices and cultural continuity?
And this is where the sources bring in those maybe surprising comparisons to big corporations.
It seems counterintuitive at first, maybe. Practical frameworks for adaptive capacity.
It makes sense when you think about it. The most agile global companies facing constant market shifts, they realize that old-style, top-down control just doesn't work anymore. It's too slow, too rigid.
Exactly. They hit the limits of centralization. So you see these huge firms, names like Nestle, Procter & Gamble, they're actively changing their structures. They talk about giving more power to the market.
Which means
it literally means putting more feet on the ground, empowering local teams, people closer to the customers, closer to the context, to actually make decisions, not just follow orders from headquarters.
But hang on, is that a fair comparison? I mean, corporations decentralize mostly to boost profits, right? To react faster to consumer whims. Can we really use a Nestle model to achieve something like cultural continuity? Their core goal is fundamentally different.
That's a really important, critical question. And you're right, the ultimate goal is different. We're not saying communities should maximize profit like P&G, but the structural principle of how is strikingly similar and relevant.
Okay, the principle being?
That complex, rapidly changing local environments demand localized decision-making power. The pilots these companies ran proved it. When they empowered local units, they operated at significantly lower cost. Okay, that's efficiency. But more importantly for our discussion, it led to better and faster decisions. Why? Because those decisions incorporated local knowledge and context. The mechanism of decentralized authority is the key takeaway for SRG 7.
Okay, so it's the structure, not the motive.
Yeah.
And the Coca-Cola example fits here too, right? The franchise model.
Perfectly. Coke has this massive global brand, huge scale, but its power on the ground comes from the franchise model, which is intensely local.
Right, local bottlers, distributors.
And that reinforces this idea of made in or made by local people. When a product feels local, when it aligns with local culture, when it's supported by local decision makers, it builds trust, deep trust.
And that trust translates to resilience.
Absolutely. That localized approach, that cultural resonance, is credited with driving double-digit growth for them, even in really volatile markets like Turkey. Local alignment isn't just nice to have, it's actually a core strategic advantage. It builds resilience.
So, translating that back to communities in SRG 7, a biosocial system needs its own kind of governance franchise. The power to make local, adaptive choices that fit its unique cultural operating system.
Precisely. That local capacity is essential, and it absolutely must integrate strong ecological practices. This isn't optional. It needs real financial muscle behind it.
You mean dedicated funding?
Serious, non-negotiable financial mobilization. Look at the Bank of China example. They significantly boosted their green credit balance, like by almost 17%.
Okay.
But it wasn't just throwing money around. It was specifically targeted. Green building projects, higher quality economic development that aligns with environmental goals, that's directing capital flow strategically to support the regenerative vision.
And on the corporate side, accountability means more than just writing a report. It means tracking the full impact.
Right. We see companies like Novo Nordisk making progress towards zero environmental impact, a core strategic goal. Not just a PR line.
How do they back that up?
They're transparently tracking their total Kodo equivalent emissions, and this includes Scope 1, 2, and 3.
Scope 3, that's the whole supply chain, right? Not just their own operations.
Exactly. It's the hardest part, but the most meaningful. They're also tracking their plastic footprint. That level of tracking shows a systematic commitment. embedding accountability deep into operations.
And then there's L'Oreal, putting serious money, 100 million, into a sustainable innovation accelerator, focused on things like refillable beauty.
Yeah, that's significant because it shows they recognize the need for deep structural innovation. It's not just about making existing products slightly less bad. It's about investing in fundamentally new regenerative systems and infrastructure, addressing the gaps.
So these are examples of the kind of structural, financial, and operational commitments needed to make regenerative practices feasible at scale. The biosocial system and cultural continuity. Yellowstone in our world in data. Let's circle back to that core idea. The community is a biosocial system. The sources use Yellowstone National Park as a kind of model for this adaptive capacity, this continuous learning. How does Yellowstone illustrate J7?
Yellowstone works because it has built-in institutional mechanisms for continuous learning. They don't just rely on historical data or static plans.
They're constantly monitoring.
Constantly. Long-term monitoring of key ecological indicators, think white bark pine health, snowpack levels, animal populations. But, and this is crucial, they combine that hard scientific data with what they call ground truthing.
Ground truthing.
Yeah, incorporating the observations and knowledge of people actually out in the park. Rangers, field staff, locals maybe. It's a synthesis. Rigorous data meets on-the-ground, experiential knowledge. That continuous feedback loop is what allows a system, whether it's a park or a community, to actually adapt effectively to localized changes.
That makes sense. You need both the big picture data and the nuanced local understanding. And this need for adaptation, for cultural continuity, it connects deeply to bigger trends like global demographics. The sources highlight the really dramatic drop in fertility rates worldwide.
Yes, drawing from our world in data, the primary driver identified is women's empowerment, specifically through education and access to the labor market.
Okay, that's fairly well known. But what's the cultural mechanism here?
The key insight is that this empowerment doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's facilitated by the emergence of new values, and those new values arise from political and social dialogues within the community. It requires a local cultural shift, not just an economic one.
Which is why those examples from India, Kerala, and Tamil Nadu are so powerful.
Exactly. These are states that made high female literacy a priority decades ago. That literacy became the structural foundation. It enabled women and the whole community to engage in those crucial dialogues, to question old norms, and to embrace new values around family size and women's roles without it being forced on them.
So it proves cultural continuity isn't about freezing things in time.
Not at all. It's about empowering the community to navigate its own cultural evolution in ways that support well-being and sustainability. Self-determination.
And underlying all of this capacity for adaptation, for education, for dialogue, is the power of local finance, how resources are raised and spent locally.
We often overlook how fundamental this is. If you look back historically, the big expansion of public education in industrialized countries, the engine of literacy and empowerment we just talked about, was largely funded by taxes raised locally.
Right. Like in France after 1833, the local communes got the power to tax for schools.
Exactly. Those local fiscal decisions shaped the social structure. They determined who had access to knowledge and opportunity. They built the foundation for the kind of self-steering learning community that SRG 7 envisions. Ultimately, SRG 7 is a mandate to trust the local, trust the decentralized agent to be the best source of adaptation and resilience.
Okay, so SRG 7 gives us the adaptive, decentralized structures. But those structures, they don't mean much if the power dynamics within them are totally skewed, right? If resources are still unfairly distributed.
Precisely. Which leads us directly to SRG 8, empowered and strong communities. This goal hits the justice issue head-on. It's the justice-centered foundation for everything else in Meta-SRG 2.
So it's about fairness, equity.
It's about making the moral imperative structural. SRG 8 demands actual redistribution of power and resources, not just, tinkering around the edges or mitigating the worst symptoms of inequality. It's about tackling historical and ongoing injustices at their roots.
And the core question here is pretty blunt then.
Yeah. What ethical commitments and what structural reforms do we actually need to make this happen? To redistribute power and resources fairly across communities, across generations, and address those deep-seated injustices.
And right away, the analysis seems to push back against just, simple cash handouts or broad wealth transfers. It argues for something more sophisticated.
Right. It calls for sophisticated institutional design, targeting specific structural leverage points where interventions can have the biggest impact on power dynamics, structural reforms, and resource redistribution.
Okay, so what does that look like? How do you design financial institutions, for example, to empower communities?
Well, look at the data cited from banks like ICBC in China. Their loan growth wasn't just general, it was significantly higher in specific strategic sectors:
Hmm.
manufacturing, science and tech innovation, green development.
So they were deliberately steering capital.
Exactly. A strategic redirection of finance towards national goals for innovation and sustainability. That's a structural intervention.
And it wasn't just big projects. It included smaller players.
That's the crucial part for empowerment. Their loans to small and micro enterprises, the really local businesses, grew even faster, by over 17%. That's channeling capital directly to the base, supporting local entrepreneurship, countering the tendency for finance to just concentrate at the top.
And this idea of targeting investment for maximum equity, it parallels the recommendations on education spending, too.
Well, yes, the argument is that the need to reduce inequality is very strong, specifically at the bottom. Therefore, public spending on education should be weighted more towards the lower levels, primary and secondary school.
Why focus there instead of, say, universities?
Because investment at the foundational level creates the biggest long-term equity impact. It reaches the most marginalized groups and gives them the basic tools they need. Whereas heavily subsidizing higher education often ends up disproportionately benefiting those who are already more privileged, it's about structural leverage for equity.
Okay, that makes sense. The sources also make a really powerful case connecting political structures directly to community survival, especially regarding famine.
This is absolutely fundamental to SRG 8. Political accountability isn't just abstract, it's literally life insurance for communities.
How so?
The dramatic decline in huge, life-destroying famines globally isn't primarily because we got better at delivering aid. It's strongly correlated with the spread of stable, functioning, multi-party democracies.
Really? Democracies prevent famine.
The mechanism is accountability. In a functioning democracy with a free press and opposition parties, authorities have strong incentives to respond quickly to food crises. They know they'll be held accountable if they don't. Today's deadly famines. They almost always occur in conflict zones or under totalitarian regimes where that accountability is absent. Political structure is a direct structural defense for community strength.
Wow. Okay. What about foundational injustices in areas like health, especially in lower-income countries where people often face crippling costs?
For health equity, the core structural reform needed is in financing. To get towards universal health coverage, you need government-led or publicly mandated financing system.
To get away from.
High out-of-pocket spending. When people have to pay significant amounts for healthcare right when they need it, it structurally guarantees that the poorest are excluded or that illness drives families into deep poverty. Public or mandated finance is a structural commitment to health justice. It removes that barrier.
That brings us to maybe the most striking statistic in this whole section, the one about the deworming program in Kenya. The return on investment seems almost unbelievable.
It's the kind of data point that should completely change how we think about aid and empowerment. This wasn't a massive infrastructure project. It was a simple, cost-effective community health action treating children for intestinal worms.
And the result?
For every $100 spent, the estimated return was 13.9 additional years of education attained by those children over their lifetimes.
13.9 years. For $100, that's just staggering. Why is such a simple local health intervention so much more powerful than, say, building a fancy new school or rewriting the curriculum?
Because it hits a critical synergy point. Health, nutrition, and the ability to learn are incredibly tightly linked, especially for young children. Worms drain nutrients, make kids sick, reduce school attendance, and impair focus.
So fixing that unlocks potential elsewhere.
Exactly. Treat the worms, and suddenly kids absorb more nutrients, they feel better, they go to school more regularly, and they can actually concentrate while they're there. It proves that sometimes the most powerful levers for empowerment are hyper-local, relatively simple, and require trusting local actors to identify and deliver those high-impact, low-cost solutions. It's a massive validation of the SRG 8 principle. Empowered communities deliver incredible results. Ethical commitments and global disparities.
Now, SRG 8 also pushes us to look beyond just local or national issues. It demands ethical commitments regarding how global markets work. For instance, the debate around pharmaceutical pricing.
Yeah, the source material highlights the drug company Lilly making the case for rebalancing R&D costs. They argue that developed economies, particularly in Europe in this case, need to pay more for the R&D costs of new medicines.
Why is that an SRG 8 issue?
Because it's fundamentally an argument about global fairness. They're saying the current system, where U.S. consumers often bear a disproportionate share of the global cost of innovation, is essentially an unfair global subsidy model. Addressing that structural imbalance is an ethical commitment needed for fairer global access.
And this idea of fairness applies to competition too, right? The point made by TSMC about subsidies.
TSMC, the semiconductor giant, put it very plainly. If anybody gets a subsidy or get the incentive, it should be everybody should get the same.
A level playing field.
Exactly. Their point is that fair competition, especially in strategic industries, requires equal treatment. Massive, unequal subsidies distort markets, unfairly advantage powerful players, and ultimately undermine the potential for innovation and development in communities everywhere. It's an ethical commitment to fair structure.
And finally, SRG-8 forces us to confront a huge, visible structural injustice. The inequality within our cities. Urban poverty.
It's stark, isn't it? We tend to think of urbanization as progress, and overall, it often correlates with higher living standards. But the inequality inside cities is a massive challenge. A failure, really.
What are the numbers?
Globally, almost 1 out of every 4 people living in cities lives in what's defined as a slum household, lacking basics like decent space, clean water, sanitation, or secure tenure, knowing they won't be evicted tomorrow.
1 in 4 globally.
And in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, it's over half. More than 50% of urban dwellers living in slum conditions. This failure to provide basic dignity and security for such a huge portion of the urban population shows just how far we are from fulfilling SRG-8's mandate for justice and empowerment. Addressing these deep internal inequalities has to be central.
Okay, so we've got adaptive structures from SRG-7 and the need for a justice foundation from SRG-8. Now we move to SRG-9, pluralism and narrative resilience. This one feels different. It's about valuing diversity itself.
Exactly. SRG-9 makes a crucial shift. It says that diversity, cultural diversity, different ways of knowing, epistemic diversity, symbolic diversity isn't a problem to be managed or overcome. It's a vital asset, something to be actively cultivated.
An asset for resilience.
Absolutely. This goal is about identity, how we govern ourselves, and how we institutionalize respect for plural systems, legal systems, cultural norms, ways of understanding the world, recognizing them as core drivers of strength.
So the mission here is figuring out the how.
Right. What governance mechanisms can we actually create to recognize and protect these plural systems, including things like symbolic landscapes, places that hold deep cultural meaning and ancestral knowledge? How do we bake that respect into the system? Institutionalizing plural systems and identity.
Again, it seems like decentralized governance is the only practical way to support this kind of pluralism.
Yeah.
One size fits all just won't work.
It fundamentally can't. How could one centralized model possibly align with dozens, maybe hundreds, of distinct local cultures and needs simultaneously? It's impossible.
So the organizational design has to change.
Radically. It needs to move away from models that just focus on distributing services or resources top-down, treating communities as passive recipients. The structure itself needs to fuse cultural understanding with operational strategy. It needs to actively support local agendas and cultural alignment. The plural nature of reality, which the GWT affirms, simply demands decentralized, culturally attuned structures.
But it's not just about budgets or org charts, is it? SRG-9 says this institutionalization reaches into the symbolic realm, the stories, the arts. The sources even bring in Plato here.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Plato warned thousands of years ago that changing a society's foundational arts, he mentioned music and gymnastics specifically, isn't trivial. He said it works secretly upon the characters of individuals and can eventually undermine the laws themselves.
Wow. So culture shapes character, which shapes society.
That's the insight. And it makes Plato's warning profoundly relevant today. It implies that governance has a responsibility to protect the symbolic landscape, the cultural forms of a community, because that culture is a powerful, if often invisible, form of governance itself. Degrading a community's core cultural forms isn't just sad, it can actually destabilize the community.
So protecting symbolic landscapes, protecting cultural forms, it's not just nostalgia, it's about maintaining social cohesion and character.
Exactly. And you see modern businesses implicitly recognizing this. Look at successful global media companies. They can't just dub movies or translate articles and expect them to resonate everywhere.
Right.
They need teams on the ground that understand local tastes and cultures. They need local creators to make content that actually connects. That's a commercial acknowledgement that narrative power, narrative resilience depends on local voice, local authenticity.
But if we're institutionalizing all these different identities and narratives, isn't there a danger of just reinforcing divisions, of promoting tribalism?
That's the absolute critical balancing act, and it requires a core ethical commitment alongside the structural changes.
Which is,
The rejection of tribalism itself. Arthur Brooks's work, in the context of GWT, really highlights this. The foundation for fairness, for making pluralism work, has to be a focus on the oneness of human beings.
seeing shared humanity first.
Right. Tribalism, Brooks argues, is built on an illusion of fundamental separateness. But GWT affirms we're all interconnected relational beings. Contempt, hostility, conflict, they tend to flare up precisely when people feel excluded, when their identity or their narrative is dismissed or attacked. So pluralism can only thrive if it starts from a deep recognition of shared humanity beneath the cultural differences. Cultural malleability and adaptive governance.
Okay, here's a really powerful idea from SRG 9. The finding that social norms, cultural beliefs, they aren't set in stone. They can be actively and rapidly changed.
This is huge, especially when we think about that speed depth paradox later. It means culture isn't just this slow, immovable glacier. It can shift.
And governance can play a role in encouraging positive shifts.
Absolutely. It can actively leverage channels like media to foster normative change. That study about introducing cable television into rural India is a perfect example of the mechanism.
What happened there?
Villages got access to cable TV, which exposed residents, many for the first time, to depictions of educated, urban, often more independent female role models. People saw different ways of living, different values presented in relatable stories.
And it had a measurable effect on attitudes.
A significant effect. Researchers measured a decrease in the stated acceptability of things like domestic violence and the traditional preference for sons over daughters. Just exposure to different narratives started to shift deeply ingrained cultural norms.
Wow. So it shows culture is malleable, and things like media, stories, education, they could be tools for positive transformation, potentially much faster than waiting for laws to change everything.
Exactly. And it highlights again the importance of literacy, which we touched on in SRG 7. Literacy is often the prerequisite. It enables people to access new ideas, engage in those critical political and social dialogues, and ultimately drive the emergence of new values from within.
Like in Kerala and Tamil Nadu again.
Their high literacy rates created the capacity for that internal cultural dialogue and transformation.
Okay, let's talk about legal pluralism.
Yeah.
The ecological civilization framework calls for this. How do we go beyond just acknowledging traditional laws or customs and give them real teeth? Formal legal recognition.
It requires specific governance mechanisms.
Yeah.
One key step is formally recognizing environmental rights as basic citizens' rights within the legal system.
How does that help?
It gives local communities and NGOs a legal basis, a hook, to defend their specific local environment and the cultural practices tied to it. It moves from abstract cultural value to an enforceable right. And alongside that, you need to improve systems like environmental public interest litigation, make it easier for citizens and groups to actually bring cases to court to protect their local environment and culture. Access to justice is crucial.
And this also means taking traditional wisdom seriously, right? Not just seeing it as folklore.
Absolutely. We need to actively promote and leverage traditional culture where it supports sustainability. The example given is the role of religion and traditional beliefs among Tibetans in fostering a harmonious coexistence with nature. That's not just a quaint belief, it's an effective, existing, culturally embedded governance mechanism for ecological stewardship. SRG 9 says, don't ignore that. Recognize it, learn from it, protect it, and integrate it as a legitimate source of governance and resilience.
All right, SRG 10,
Yeah.
knowledge, diversity, and inclusion. This feels very connected to SRG 9's focus on pluralism and narrative, but maybe more focused on the knowing part.
That's a perfect way to frame it. If SRG 9 is about respecting different narratives and identities, SRG 10 is about epistemic sovereignty, epistemic justice.
Epistemic justice, what's that exactly?
It's the right of all communities to define, share, and govern their own knowledge. It's the right to be recognized as legitimate knowers, not just as, say, data points for scientists or subjects to be studied. SRG 10 argues this is an absolute precondition for sustainability efforts to be seen as legitimate and to actually work.
Okay, so the core question is, how do we achieve that?
How can we formally recognize and, more importantly, integrate all these diverse knowledge systems, indigenous ways of knowing, local experiential knowledge, scientific knowledge, even spiritual insights into governance structures in a way that achieves this epistemic justice?
And the sources stress a key difference here. It's not just about consulting people anymore. It's about integration. What does that look like in practice? How is it different? Mechanisms for formal knowledge integration.
It implies a real shift in power over how decisions are made. Consultation often means experts listen politely, maybe take a few notes, and then go back and make the decision based on their own framework. Integration is different.
How so?
Look at the ecological civilization model again, calling for co-management systems in autonomous regions. It explicitly says management of ecologically sensitive areas must draw upon the skills and knowledge of local people.
So local knowledge isn't just input.
Exactly. It becomes foundational to the management authority itself. Local people, with their traditional farming methods or their understanding of local weather patterns or sacred groves, share decision-making power alongside the scientists or government officials. Their knowledge is treated as equally valid and necessary.
That's a significant shift. And there's a parallel drawn here with how innovative companies handle data, isn't there? About democratizing access.
Yeah, it's an interesting analogy for achieving knowledge parity. The most adaptive organizations, the ones that learn fast, they build systems to make data seamlessly available to everybody on an end-to-end basis. They break down data silos.
Okay.
Now, think about that in a community context. If local communities have easy access to relevant data, environmental data, economic data, health data, and the tools and capacity to analyze it themselves, it enables a kind of epistemological democratization.
They can generate their own insights from their own data.
Right. They're not just relying on outside experts to tell them what the data means for them. They gain distributed analysis capacity. They can validate their own experiences with data or challenge external findings using their local context. It empowers them as knowers.
But okay, this sounds great in theory, integrating scientific models, local observations, maybe spiritual beliefs. How do you actually do that? They seem like such different ways of understanding the world. Isn't there a huge methodological problem?
It's definitely a challenge. And it requires a methodology that embraces the GWT's core idea. Reality is plural. We need a way to synthesize, not just aggregate, these different forms of knowledge.
And the sources point back to philosophy again, to Plato.
Remarkably, yes. Plato identified dialectic as the method for this kind of knowledge integration. For him, dialectic wasn't just about arguing, it was about carefully combining different pieces of knowledge, different perspectives, and trying to see their natural relationship to true being. How they fit together to reveal a deeper truth. He called it the coping stone of the sciences, the thing that holds everything else together.
But it wasn't just about pure abstract knowledge for Plato, was it? The sources mentioned something about impure sciences.
This is maybe one of the most profound insights for practical sustainability. Plato recognized, and the sources emphasize, that a purely abstract theoretical approach isn't enough. The dialectic must incorporate what might be called the impure sciences and arts. Things full of guesswork, traditional practices passed down through generations, intuition, experiential knowledge. Think traditional ecological knowledge about planting cycles, or a farmer's feel for the weather, or local healing practices. These are impure in the sense that they might not fit neat scientific models, but they are essential. Plato basically said, man cannot live upon pure mathematics alone.
You can't run a farm or a community based only on algorithms and abstract principles.
Exactly. A perfect scientific model for managing a forest might be technically brilliant, but if it completely ignores the local community's spiritual connection to that forest or their traditional harvesting practices, it will fail. It lacks legitimacy, it won't be adopted, it won't work. Integration requires weaving together the pure and the impure.
That really lands. And this need for knowledge that is trusted, that is seen as legitimate, connects to the rise of sovereign AI, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. We're seeing nations around the world pushing to develop their own AI capabilities, sovereign AI factories, using their own domestic infrastructure, their own data, training their own talent.
It sounds like technological nationalism, maybe.
It's partly about that, sure, security, economic competitiveness. But underneath, it's also a profound institutional move towards epistemic sovereignty. It's nations saying the algorithms that will shape our future, the knowledge systems embedded in this powerful technology, must be built on our data, reflect our values, understand our context, and be governed by us. It's about institutionalizing the use of local data and expertise to ensure legitimacy and prevent external digital or cognitive colonization, if you will. Point 2. Knowledge pluralism in practice. Yellowstone.
Yeah, let's bring this back to Yellowstone again. We talked about its adaptive capacity, SRG 7. It also seems to be a practical example of SRG-10, of institutionalizing different knowledge systems, particularly indigenous knowledge.
It really is. The Interagency Bison Management Plan is a prime example. This wasn't just Yellowstone deciding something. It was formally adopted by federal agencies, the state of Montana, and several tribal partners.
So the tribes are actual partners in the plan.
Co-managers. The structure of the plan itself mandates the integration of tribal perspectives and knowledge into decisions about bison conservation. It creates a shared, complex legal and policy space where different knowledge systems and jurisdictions have to interact and find common ground. That's institutionalized pluralism.
And they use ethnography too, not just for historical interest.
Right. Park managers formally use ethnographic methods, talking to people, understanding their perspectives specifically to learn how different groups, especially associated tribes, identify themselves and understand their connections to the park landscape. And that understanding directly informs how they make decisions about preserving resources, both natural and cultural. It's about respecting and incorporating identity and knowledge into the management itself.
And underpinning all of this, the ability for these diverse knowledge systems to even exist and be shared loops back to SRG-8, doesn't it? The need for safety and accountability.
Absolutely critical. You can't have knowledge diversity if the communities holding that knowledge are under threat or lack basic political freedoms. The point about stable democracies preventing mass starvation is relevant again here. Without basic physical security and democratic accountability, traditional communities and their unique knowledge systems simply cannot survive, let alone thrive or be integrated into wider governance. Epistemic justice requires a foundation of political security and institutional accountability.
Okay, we've reached the final goal in this cluster, SRG-11, ecocultural vibrancy and well-being. This feels like where everything comes together. SRG-7's adaptation, SRG-8's justice, SRG-9's pluralism, SRG-10's knowledge diversity.
Exactly. SRG-11 is the synthesis. It's about recognizing and institutionalizing the reality that culture and ecology aren't separate boxes. They are deeply, fundamentally interdependent.
So we stop managing them in isolation.
Right. This goal envisions regional planning that actively cultivates what it calls ecocultural vibrancy. It explicitly tries to reinforce the links between cultural identity, the symbolic meaning of landscapes, and the actual health of the ecosystem.
So the final research question for Meta-SRG2 is about this integration.
Yes. How can regional planning actively foster this ecocultural vibrancy? How do we institutionalize this deep interdependence between identity, place, and ecological health in our planning and governance systems, fusing culture, place, and well-being?
And once again, the sources start with philosophy, with Plato, to ground this idea, this time about the moral landscape.
It's another powerful insight. Plato argued that the environment people grow up in directly shapes their character. He said citizens shouldn't grow up amid images of moral deformity, think pollution, ugliness, degradation, but should live in a land of health and beauty.
Why? What was his reasoning?
He believed that a healthy, beautiful, natural environment subtly draws the soul into likeness and sympathy with the beauty of reason. Basically, our surroundings teach us. A degraded landscape teaches degradation. A healthy landscape teaches health, and perhaps even influences our moral compass.
Wow. So the state of the environment isn't just an ecological issue. It's a cultural and even moral issue. It shapes who we become.
That's the core interdependence SRG-11 points to, which leads to the question, how can our economic activities support this connection instead of breaking it?
Right. How do we capture ecocultural value without just extracting it?
The key is to structure economic activity to explicitly realize the value of what are called ecological products. This means finding ways to convert natural and cultural assets into sustainable livelihoods, supporting things like eco-agriculture that works with the landscape, or tourism that genuinely leverages and respects the unique local culture and environment. The economy needs to reinforce the assets, not deplete them.
And the Green Rural Revival Program in Zhejiang, China, is presented as a successful example of this.
It's a really compelling case study. Zhejiang had areas facing rural decline. This program strategically leveraged their unique local assets, things like traditional bamboo cultivation, beautiful landscapes suitable for ecotourism, distinct local culture.
And it worked.
Very successfully. They managed to achieve both environmental improvements and economic prosperity by essentially marketing their ecocultural distinctiveness. They showed that rural areas can offer things cities can't: slower pace, unique folk traditions, clean air, natural beauty, and that these can be high-value products that urban residents are willing to pay for.
So it turns that old rural-urban divide into a kind of positive symbiosis. The city benefits from the preserved rural character, and the rural area prospers by preserving it.
Precisely. It demonstrates that prosperity doesn't have to mean erasing local distinctiveness. It can actually be built on celebrating and sustaining that unique ecocultural identity, institutionalizing the interdependence.
So if we want to manage for this deep interdependence, our planning has to change too. We can't just have separate departments for forestry, water, agriculture, culture.
Exactly. It requires adopting integrated spatial frameworks, thinking across silos.
The sources call it a whole-of-ecosystem approach, guided by the principle that, mountains, waters, forests.
Mountains, waters, forests, farmlands, lakes, and grasslands form a life community. It's a recognition baked into policy that these things are functionally interconnected.
So you can't manage a river properly without thinking about the mountains where it starts.
Or the farmland it flows through, or the wetlands at its mouth. It demands a truly holistic view in governance and planning. It's a radical shift institutionally, but it's necessary to reflect the actual relational reality of a biosocial system.
And Yellowstone comes up one last time, showing how you can blend different knowledge systems within institutional structures to protect these symbolic landscapes. The dual interpretation idea.
Right. Think about their visitor centers. They're not just museums. They are deliberately designed as institutional spaces where different ways of knowing meet. The example given is the Canyon Visitor Education Center.
What do they do there?
They have exhibits explaining the geology of the Yellowstone supervolcano, the science. But right alongside that, they feature a relief model where representatives from the associated tribes interpret the park's geology from their own ancestral perspective.
So, science and traditional knowledge, presented side by side, equally valid.
Exactly. That's institutionalizing the dual interpretation of a single, highly symbolic landscape. It achieves SRG 10's knowledge integration and SRG 11's eco-cultural fusion in one physical space.
And simple rules, regulations, can also enforce this interdependence, like stay in the boardwalks in thermal areas.
That's not just about tourist safety. Those strict rules protect the incredibly fragile microbial life that creates the colors and formations a unique ecological reality. But they also implicitly respect the sacredness and power those places hold in indigenous cultures. The regulation protects both the biological fragility and the cultural significance. It recognizes the ecological-cultural link at a very practical level.
Okay, so we've covered these 5 goals: adaptation, justice, pluralism, knowledge, and vibrancy. But as we wrap up Meta-SRG 2, there's this big tension hanging over it all, isn't there? This issue of time.
Ah, yes. The speed-depth paradox. It's critical.
Let's explain that.
On one hand, we have urgent global crises, climate change being the obvious one, but also biodiversity loss, resource depletion. These demand rapid, large-scale transformation. We need to accelerate change dramatically.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, everything we've just discussed in Meta-SRG 2, deep cultural change, building trust, fostering genuine dialogue, reforming institutions to be just and inclusive, integrating diverse knowledge, all of that takes time. It requires depth, deliberation, relationship building. You can't rush legitimacy.
And historically, big shifts take a long time.
Exactly. Energy transitions, for example, have typically been incredibly slow, playing out over a century or more. But the need for decarbonization now is unprecedented. It demands these huge, localized shifts, but those shifts still need to be culturally embraced and seen as legitimate to actually stick. That's the paradox. How do you accelerate deep, meaningful change without sacrificing the very legitimacy and local ownership that makes it sustainable? It's a huge governance challenge.
That paradox really brings it home, doesn't it? The need for speed versus the need for depth. A huge tension to hold as we think about implementing these ideas. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Meta-SRG 2, Empowered Communities and Cultural Sovereignty.
Yeah, and the core takeaway, I think, is that sustainable regionalization, if it's going to work, can't just be about technical fixes imposed from the top down.
Right.
It fundamentally requires designing governance, the rules, the institutions, the processes, in a way that genuinely enables communities to be the agents of their own transformation, rooted in their own unique cultures, their diverse ways of knowing, their right to self-determination. The legitimacy has to come from the local.
We saw that requires real structural changes, things like targeted finance, prioritizing foundational education, ensuring democratic accountability isn't just a slogan, but a defense mechanism.
And it needs deep ethical commitments, too, rejecting tribalism, acknowledging global unfairness, focusing on justice.
And that philosophical thread running through it, that resilience comes from relationship and justice, not just control. That idea of integrating the pure science with the impure local knowledge.
Yeah.
Because you can't run the world on pure mathematics alone.
Exactly. The cultural, the ethical, the experiential, they aren't secondary. They're essential ingredients for any change that's meant to last.
So going back to that speed-depth paradox, if deep structural change is slow, but the ecological need is urgent, where do we find leverage? What can potentially move faster?
Well, structural change might be slow, but maybe ethical alignment, shifts in values can happen more quickly sometimes, which leads to the final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to chew on.
Okay, what is it?
Given this tension, this paradox, what role could protecting intangible symbolic capital play in accelerating the ethical shift we need? Think about things like preserving cultural narratives, honoring ancestral wisdom, consciously caring for the moral landscape Plato talked about. If cultural continuity holds the memory needed for adaptation, shouldn't protecting that memory, that symbolic capital, be a top priority for accelerating our ethical alignment towards sustainability? How do we value and protect that?
That's a powerful question. Can protecting the intangible actually speed up the tangible changes we need? Something profound to consider as you reflect on this deep connection between culture, community, place, and governance. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.